Thank you, Bob. And I'm John, N4TOL, and great to see you all here today. Our next speaker is Jamie Dupree, and I'm sure most of you in the Georgia or greater Atlanta area know Jamie. So he and I go back, as you know, he works with WSB TV and Radio, which is part of the Cox Broadcasting group of TV and radio stations across the country. I'm an alumni there and was with them for a little over 28 years, a great company. Jamie is now approaching 27 years with Cox. And I was there a little bit before him, as you'll see from his youthful looks. But for about 20 of those years, we were there together and didn't work very closely or see each other much, but we did know we were each amateurs and kind of kept in touch that way. And we've tried to get him here for probably the last 5 years to come to our event, but as you know, since we're in this first or second week of November, and if you know the type of work he does out of the DC Bureau and all the politics, every even year is his Super Bowl with the election coverage, so that was always ruled out. And since he's always on the go, it was tough to get him here on the odd years. And as evidence of being on the go, Jamie's here today. Tuesday he was in Milwaukee for the presidential debates. Today he's flying out of here to Jacksonville to party with Herman Cain and Neil Bortz at some event. And he's squeezed us in, and we're very happy to have him here. So I'll let Jamie come up. He's a great asset to amateur radio and also to the Atlanta community with what he does on the air. So, and he'll tell you about his amateur radio career, I'm sure.
Thank you, everyone. I am Jamie Dupree. I'm also NS3T. Even some of the people who were here today that I met who listened to me on the radio didn't know I was a ham until recently. If you don't listen to me, then I'll put in a plug. I'm on WSB and have been since 1988 as our Washington correspondent. I also juggle stations in not only Atlanta, but also a small station in Athens that our company owns, one in Jacksonville, Florida, one in Orlando, and one in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then what is the best affiliate I have? Dayton, Ohio. And so it just happens that I have to go visit my station in Dayton in May of almost every year. And even better, the station is located just across the parking lot from the big Marriott downtown, and so the company just happens to have to put me up there. It works out very, very well. I have been a ham since, 1981. I don't usually say this kind of thing on the radio because I know the response that it draws, but I did meet a couple people here earlier today who went to my fair school. If you drive down Interstate 75 for about 6-7 hours, you will reach the University of Florida. And I got my ticket there as a freshman. We had a fantastic club station and still do W4DFU. We used to get in big pileups late at night and we would yell, F you, F you. And I'll never forget one time somebody came back and said, F you, what's your call? And I said, W4DFU, University of Florida. And you could tell he didn't like that answer, but it was a great little place. We had a lot of fun. I learned a lot, met a whole bunch of people. I think most of them are probably not in ham radio any longer, but it started me not only on a great path of being an amateur radio operator, but being in the business of radio as well. Do I need to flip the button, or you got it for me there? Oh, it's on the table here? Okay, there it is, the clicker. The red button? All right, it seems sort of odd that there could be links between amateur radio and radio news, but I'll tell you, the other night I walked into what they call the spin room outside the Republican debate in Milwaukee. It's where the candidates and or their aides come and try to spin us on what we had just witnessed over the last 90 minutes or so. And I walked in the room, and I was a little late getting there because I had to finish my blog to get something up and file a story really quick. And so I ran up the stairs and ran in the room. Donald Trump was there, Ben Carson was there, John Kasich was there, and it was just a mob scene. And I thought to myself, this is just like a pileup. And I couldn't get close to Trump. I managed to get a picture. There was one debate where I happened to be in the right place afterwards, and I managed to get some audio with him. that night, I couldn't get close to him. I tried to get over toward Carson, and people are bumping all over the place, and elbows are flying. I couldn't get close to him. I needed Kasich, Governor Kasich, and since I have a station in Ohio, that's something I really need to get. And so I'm forcing my way in. And I got in a verbal scrape with a still photographer, as we call them, regular photographs, like the still photography going on there. And he and I got in a little scrape. I was getting in the way of his award-winning photograph, so I could stick my microphone in there. But it was like a pileup. I don't care. I'm getting this contact. I'm getting this soundbite. And I got my soundbite. And then I got out of there, and I went back to finish my work. So sometimes amateur radio is like, I tend to be a guy who will wait until late in sort of the questions with a politician and then throw one in at the end. Sort of like I'm a tail ender in pileups, trying to drop my call sign in there late in hopes that my alleged 100 watts, more like probably 70 after it gets to the antenna, will actually do something. Let's see, how do I hit? Which one do I? Right hand button, there we go. It's an old picture of me actually here with the shack. I'm now down in an unfinished basement right next to my setup. If you ever hear me on the radio from in the morning, I'm at home in my basement. I have a little setup where one table is to broadcast and one table is ham radio. And sometimes in the wintertime, the radio just happens to be on 160 in the morning when I'm in between live shots trying desperately to find another country. I'm up to 84 low power on 160, so I'm hoping to squeeze out those next 100 as we get going. This is a picture that was actually taken here at the Republican debate at the Reagan Library out in California back in September. And I wrote a piece the other day on my blog, which goes up at WSBradio.com, about sort of the 24 hours of covering political events. And somebody sent me an email who is a ham, and he said, "This sounds worse than a radio contest." And in many ways, they're very much alike. A few years back, I think it was 2010, I did a program all night long for all of our stations, taking phone calls about the election results. And the next day, and I stayed up the whole next day and did all the work and everything. And the next day, I got all these emails from people, "I can't believe you were able to stay up all night and do all that." And I thought to myself, yeah, it's just like working CQ Worldwide. It's really not a problem. But there's a lot of people that don't like to stay up all night. But for me, butt-in-chair time works both in a contest and at work as well. It's really very similar. What led me into radio? Mike was talking about it earlier. I had grown up in Chicago and Detroit along the way. I was a paper boy. For whatever reason, there was a radio at the local department store that I couldn't take my eyes off. And for $149.95, I looked at that thing for months and finally bought it when I was 13. It had those buttons that said SW 1, 2, and 3. I didn't know what they were, but it led me into shortwave radio. I DX'd airport beacons on long wave. I had, rotatable antennas that I made and all kinds of stuff. I did utility stations and shortwave listening and things like that. And then I got to college and I got my ticket in 1981 as a novice. Upgraded to general soon after. I think I had to drive to Baltimore. There wasn't even a testing site in DC, if you could imagine at the time, back in the old days, the FCC. And then upgraded in the late 80s finally to extra, I will brag and say a real extra with the code and everything. And most of my time, I don't rag chew. I always feel bad. I get listeners who will contact me and say, "Could you meet me up on 20 meters? And my answer always is, no, I just don't rag chew. CW contesting is pretty much it for me, with a little voice contesting, as you'll see in a little while. Meanwhile, while that was going on, I was starting in my radio job. My first radio job was spinning jazz records 2 nights a week on the graveyard shift while I was going to college. It was great. I went back years later and reconstructed my life as a junior in college, and I worked every hour of the week at some point in time during the 7 days. I had 2 nights a week that I did jazz. Well, 1 night a week I did a blues radio show, and then I did some news along the way. My first big story was the U.S. Marine barracks in Lebanon were bombed in 1983. I was working the overnight on a Saturday night. It was during the football season. My dream was I was going to be a sports broadcaster. So I was standing in the back by the AP wire machine, and the scores were coming off the AP wire machine I had a long record on, and I was reading the scores out loud. I was practicing. And then that wire machine started going crazy with the reports. You know, this was back before we didn't even have cable, I don't think, at the time in the newsroom. And so it brought the first word of that. I went on the air and read the stories, and the news director called me the next day and said, "Seems like you might have an interest in this, come see me." And so that started my news career. I made it up to DC, a small little seat of the pants AM station in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where I used to pester the engineer. It was 1600 AM, and I said, "Please let me plug into those 3 towers for the 160 contest. Please, come on." No, he never would let me. He was not a ham. It used to be that every engineer I met at the stations was a ham. It's just not true anymore. This is at that station, 1986. It's hard to see, but I've got my IC2AT on my back pants pocket there, my shorts pocket, brought it along. You know, the goofball news guy who's also got his ham radio with me. But for me, it was a way to do stuff. Do you remember Hands Across America? This was Hands Across America ran outside of our station in the suburbs of DC, and we were out there doing that. You know, along the way, I've used ham radio at times. When we were in college, the invasion of Grenada, remember there was some U.S. dental school students who were in Grenada, and I think it was a KA2 call, if I remember correctly, stroke J3, and they finally pushed him up outside the top of the 20-meter band. And we got in the school newspaper monitoring his transmissions, and we used to do stuff that I did at college. I used to do phone patches for the Maritime Mobile Net, helped out with the Hurricane Hunters Net and all kinds of stuff. So we had a great station in college. We had a TH6 up on top of a 14-story building on campus. So you can imagine what that was like in terms of coverage. And of course, I've never had an antenna set up like that again, but it was fun to do. And so it led into doing contests, organized HF and VHF contests and more, and it was a lot of fun. Met a lot of good people. The other thing, natural disasters and hurricanes. I used to take my 2-meter radio with me. I covered a lot of hurricanes when I was single down in the Carolinas and things like that. I remember Hurricane Hugo was the first one I ever covered, and actually ran into a couple of reporters that way by being on 2 meters and hearing people doing Skywarn reports and more before they would ever obviously hit the wire or the weather service and be reported. It was sort of a great way to find out things and hear stuff going on the ground that you don't hear otherwise. And so remember, there used to be rules. You cannot use ham radio for news reporting, and one of those crazy FCC kind of dictums that has gone away over the years. I took my news senses and my ham radio and put it together. Some of you may have read my website that I ran for 5 years. It was called radiosport.net. It was totally focused on contesting and contest news. And what I did with it, it worked out perfect. I just had this great, I was always frustrated that as we got into the internet age, we did not seem to have as much background as I thought we needed to have about contest and contesting on the internet. Isn't it funny how in our hobby we get in these little stovepipes and we don't really want to talk to each other sometimes, and God forbid anybody give anyone else a tip about contesting, because you might give away your secret of how you're going to win the contest that you never really win. And so I try to, through this website, not only do stories about contests, about contesting ethics and more, but about how you put together sort of your game plan for doing a contest. And it wasn't just the big shots, it was the little guys too. How do you go about finding those extra multipliers in those new countries? How do you go about sleeping? What's your choice? I remember John K4BAI, his greatest advice was sleep when the Europeans sleep. So you get your couple of hours of sleep between like 2 and 5 a.m. or something like that in a big contest. So it was a lot of fun. I did it for 5 years. I do remember, I think it was 2008 or 2012, being on the road covering the presidential campaign and thinking, it's 2 a.m. and I've got to write a story about this contest coming up this week. So after a while, I finally gave that up. Some other person took it over, and then I think they realized pretty quick how it wasn't very easy to write these kind of stories. But it was great. I got to meet people from all over the world, and it made going to the Crowne Plaza Hotel for the big contesting reception in Dayton a lot more fun, to meet a lot more people. I think that telling the stories about our hobby, to me, is oh so important. Social media, however you want to use it, publicizing our hobby helps everybody. I mean, I was amazed today, just by putting up something on Twitter today about ham radio, there was somebody else, a listener, who said, I didn't know you were ham. And it's a reminder that you can talk about it, you can have the license plates, you can have the antennas, but there's always somebody else out there to talk to about it. And it's a great hobby. It's a lot of fun to be on radio, whether here in Atlanta or around the country, and have somebody say, well, geez, I had no idea you were in ham radio. The one thing that I use sort of my radio news operation and abilities and being a ham is putting together a series of voice files, recorded voice files, to allow me to contest without using a microphone. I wrote a story about this for CQ Magazine a couple of years ago. And it frustrates the living daylights out of some in the ham radio community that I have the audacity to get on the air and not be live. But my microphone is nowhere close to the shack table. It's all my recorded voice. If you've ever had a contact with me in a phone contest, you have not spoken to me, you have spoken to my computer. And one of my buddies who lives down the way in DC, he will often, after we do the exchange, he will say, thanks, Hal, referring to, the famous computer. So I thought I would bring along some of that today, and of course now my computer has turned off, which will probably screw up everything that I just took time to set up earlier. But it's been a lot of fun in the sense that I used, I know how to do all the different recordings. Like this is this is a piece of freeware called Audacity. Some of you may have used it out there, and it's actually what I use for my news broadcast, for recording stories. Life is so much easier now. I could, if something terrible happened, I could sit down in this room here, record something, pop it onto my laptop right here, edit it using this software, and then email it out to my stations. And it will sound like I'm right there. Whereas before, you had to find a phone and all kinds of stuff. I remember covering the campaign, I think it was 1996, one of my favorite stops at the Macon Gun Club. You can fill it in what it was, the Macon Gun Club down a very red dirt road in Macon. And while I was doing my report, it was Lamar Alexander, now a senator from Tennessee, who was running for president, and former Georgia Senator Saxby Chambliss had come out to shoot with him. And during my whole report on the phone from there, you could hear the gunshots in the background. It was one that I wish I'd been able to save for safekeeping forever. It would have been a great thing to hear. So this is fairly simple kind of thing here. Let's see if this is going to work first off.
Whiskey 3.
Yeah, let's turn it up here. So I have put together, with the Write Log contesting software, it's something you do have to pay for, but it's the most powerful software there is in terms of using voice files. If any of you get on next weekend for the Sweepstakes SSB contest, that contest will have the highest use of recorded voice files of any contest. But most people do this. You say to the person their call and their number, their serial number, your number of the contact, and then you hit a button and it rolls the rest of your exchange. So that's all on tape. What I have done is, remember, I have no microphone, none whatsoever. So I'm just sitting there at my computer in my basement. It's like a CW contest, pushing buttons. And let's say that I call CQ.
CQ contest. November Sierra 3 Tango. Norway Sugar 3 Tokyo contest.
I don't have to use my precious little voice because I don't want to ruin it, because come Monday morning, I don't want to have to be scratchy and talking. Old Wes calls me.
Whiskey 3, Whiskey Lima, number 129. Alpha NS3T, check 81, Maryland, D.C.
And, if Wes has a puny signal that he tends to have when, he gets on the air, I'll maybe have to ask him a few questions, and I've set these up so that I can basically...
I need your check again.
I need your check again. Well, let's see that. Wes, you're going to give me what, like a 22 or something like that? No, I'm just kidding. So Wes will give me his check, and I can then ask.
Is that 5555?
You know, I was able to write a whole string of code for all this, that when you put a figure into some of these things into some of the spots in the log in this program, it will ask the question then about what you want to find out, like this.
Is that Georgia Gulf Alpha?
So I can ask people, you know, I have all of this on tape and all ready to go. Now, some of my friends in the Potomac Valley Radio Club, the PVRC, love to come torture me while I'm running because they know my microphone isn't anywhere close to being plugged in. So they will ask me questions just to sort of give me a hard time. And so I had to put together a couple voice files to respond to that, like,
Look, don't make me take my microphone out of the cabinet to deal with you.
So this has actually worked out very well. In all seriousness, I've been able to, again, run contests totally without ever using the microphone. It aggravates some of the contesting stalwarts who don't believe that, they think that this is assisted, but we won't get into the assisted category debate or anything like that. But it's been a lot of fun to do. And like I said, I did write an article about it in CQ, and I've spent a lot of time working on it. And what's great about it is that I can not be on the air for months, and I can pull that out and just get on the air right away. And it gets me on the air. The kids don't hear me yelling. The XYL doesn't hear me yelling in the basement. And I can quietly do my contesting downstairs. All right, this is actually a little screenshot of all the different files. There's only 20 different, under write log, only 20 different files that you can use, but I've been able to come up with some sort of if-then kind of things inside this program, so that if the space in the log for the check or the section is empty, it will say, I need your check again. If I put the letters FL, it would say, is that Florida? You know, Fox Lima, something like that. So it's been a very intuitive program and fun to use. The benefits, as I always say, of contest voice files, I always say that, you know, anybody can use them. I think 10 is the smallest number that I figured that you could use. Like, you could have 2 versions of your call. You could have your name. You could say Roger, Roger, you know, thank you, because I've got all kinds of things on here, like the old, where's
Roger, Roger.
You know, that answers everything. I don't have to say QSL. Just people know that I'm on tape. Will ask me questions from time to time, and sometimes they get an expansive answer, and sometimes they don't. It's just the way it is. But it's again, next weekend, ARRSSB sweepstakes. If you hear me on NS3T, it's all on tape. It's not going to be me. All right, working ham radio. I mentioned earlier, there used to be a lot of engineers at the radio stations I worked for. Not anymore. You know, it's funny, even though the engineers are very, very much in tune with the internet and with, you know, getting things together and soldering stuff and cables and everything, I just don't see as many hams. It's unfortunate. But you know, I always sort of give them a hard time, like, when are you going to get your license? And they say, well, I've got an FCC license. I say, yeah, you just don't have the right one. You should get a different one. As I said earlier, always good to meet a listener, but I always say doubly nice to meet them when they're a ham. And it is amazing how many people I've met over the last 20 plus years who are hams around the country. And you know, I know we have worries about whether our hobby is growing, whether it's graying, whether we're really getting new people in. I want to echo what Mike said earlier about helping colleges and universities in their ham radio clubs. In my job, I get asked to do a lot of speeches, and my company has told me you can't take any money for those speeches, which is unfortunate, but okay, I get it. So what I try to do then is, if I do give speeches to different groups and they want to pay me, then I say, well, instead, you're going to give the money to a college or a university ham radio club. I've given some money down to Georgia Tech, to the University of Florida, the University of Central Florida. The problem is, a couple of years ago, I was researching, well, let me find different ham radio clubs. There's hardly any anymore at colleges that are really going. I mean, UGA doesn't have one. I tried to give them some money. They don't really have an active club. And that seems to me, if there's one thing that we could do, if we could find a way somehow to help some of these colleges and universities. I know we're trying to do everything, but boy, what a great place that would be. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on young kids, but as I remember going to college, going to class 15 hours a week was like a freaking vacation, if I remember correctly. There's a lot of extra time. So think about that. You know, it can be a local school like a Kennesaw State, or it can be a big school like a UGA. There's got to be ways that we can figure out how to get more people who are still young, but get them into the hobby. It certainly did work for me. Friends from Ham Radio, these are two different people that I found for different reasons. Paul Newberry, some of you know him, N4PN on the left. You can't beat Paul's N4 Papa November on the air. I met Paul through Ham Radio. His son is actually a very good sports writer for the AP who does a lot of work. And then Scott Redd on the right, K0DQ, who has a lot of Atlanta roots actually, and ended up as the counterterrorism chief in the Bush administration. And so I know him not only through political stuff in D.C., but also through Ham Radio and the Potomac Valley Radio Club. It's been I don't look back with any regret. My only regret on ham radio is when I lived in apartments for too many years and I couldn't put my antennas up. But I always kept getting QST. I always stayed linked to it, and the internet has only helped out even more. And so I guess my thought is that I ask everybody, think about ways that you can publicize the hobby, whether it's on Facebook, on social media, with your friends. I know everybody looks at us still and wonders, why do you have that big antenna on the back of your car? What kind of crazy person are you? But, you know, I think that the best thing is we have to be a sort of a spokesperson for our hobby at all times. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't be afraid to bore people with it, and then find ways to bring new people in. I think that's the most important thing of all. I don't want to talk the whole time. I'd like to take some questions, so I say thank you very much to John for pestering me for a number of years, and I really appreciate it. If you're a listener, even better, and if you're not, I'm on every morning at 6:45 and 8:15 on the nifty 750, as we call it, WSB. Thank you. Question, yes, sir.
Not a question to either of you colleagues in the Atlanta area. Agnes Scott has a station.
No kidding.
As far as we know, the first female colleague in the U.S. We're not positive about that.
Oh, that's great to know.
Thanks to the Authors Club and Atlanta Radio.
And if you have ideas on clubs and colleges that you know, if I have the chance to give some to, please, you know, you can find me on the internet and email them to me, ns3t at awrl.net. Thank you very much for that.
If I ask you a question, will it be live or will it be more?
No, it's going to be live. I can hook you up, though. We can find a report probably on my laptop there. It's got the last, this thing has been on the campaign since 2012, so I've got every story I've filed in the last 4 years on there. Come on, I got to have something. Yes, sir, Wes.
Well, I just want to comment, the North Fulton Amateur Radio League won Class 3A the old days. We got some more folks interested in contesting, and it's an exciting kind of an asset for them.
It is, and I know contesting gets a bad rap, and that some people look at it and just say, oh, that's the last thing I want to do, and I get that. The beautiful thing about our hobby is, right, there's so many different things that you can be in. I was up in Dayton a few years ago. We were at the Hooters where all the contesters gather on Thursday night, and some guys walked in and they said, oh, contesters, we're SSTV. And all the contesters started yelling, hey, get off 14,320 or get off 14,230. That's my frequency. So, look, I know there's different things. I do think contesting, though, is a way to get people interested, whether it's field day or whether it's sweepstakes, and to find different ways. I find that it's an easy way for people to grasp what we're doing in this hobby, but I do get it's not for everybody. I think you had a question back there. Yes, sir.
Since you cover Congress for a living, what are your observations on the amateur radio?
Yeah, I just, I look at that and I just don't see how that's going to get through the Congress. I know obviously the league is lobbying. That seems like one of those things that if you're going to get it done, it's going to have to be stuffed in a catch-all year-end bill and nobody figures out it's there until I read it 3 days later or something like that. I guess I look at it this way. I get why we would want that. I also get why the real estate industry and a lot of others would look at it and say, are you kidding? It's going to have to take a little more. Slowly and slowly, people like you can weigh in with your members of Congress. Letters do matter. Emails do matter. But I'm afraid they're going to need some magic potion to get that done. But we'll see. Yes, sir. There's one right now, a congressman named Greg Walden of Oregon, who is I think he's the head of the National Republican Campaign Committee, basically the election arm of House Republicans. He's from Oregon. He's on the Energy and Commerce Committee, if I remember correctly. His parents, his family have been in the radio business, and he is a ham. I don't think he's active or anything like that. I believe he's the only licensed ham radio operator at this point in time in the Congress. You might think there'd be one or two more, but he's the only one at this point. Yes, sir. Yeah, Boy Scouts and Girls. I mean, the merit badge that's there, you're absolutely right. And I don't know if any of you have any links to scouting, but that's an easy way to demonstrate. Another easy way is in your kids' grade school classes, just to do a quick demonstration. And of course, field day can thread it all together even easier to make it easier to take a group of scouts to something that's already there that you yourself don't have to create, and that you can find a way to get some more publicity. Yes, sir. In the back. Oh, right there. Okay. I saw another hand. Who's up? Your hand back there? Oh, you. I'm sorry. I thought it was a man. Miss, please go ahead.
Are your own old enough to be involved in what it does?
You know, my kids are 6, 8, and 11. I have not pushed any of them into radio. I think only my youngest, who is actually a mini-me, I think he's the only one that has a chance. But I've decided that I'm a big golfer too. I think ham radio is a lot like golf. You don't push people to do it. You have to have an intrinsic desire to do it. So they all know I'm down. They know I'm down in the basement. They know that I'm doing something down there with radio, talking to people all over the world. But I haven't really pushed them hard to do it. But they certainly know. They look at me quizzically when my pack of QSL cards comes in from the bureau, and I get all excited. Yes, sir. The Congress, now that ham station was taken down about 10, 15 years ago. It had been sort of Barry Goldwater, when he was a senator, he was a ham. He had an antenna up on the Russell Senate office building named for the former Georgia senator, and then they made it into, there was a room that was for the club, but it went away. In DC, ham radio is sort of interesting. The Voice of America has a club station, the World Bank has a club station, and then there's a small group of guys who, your houses are not very big in DC in terms of yards and stuff like that, but they fight all they can to get antennas up. In fact, a buddy of mine just sent me a picture this morning. Another guy had come over with his spud gun, and they'd finally lobbed the 160 wire up over his oak tree in the front. He basically, if you can imagine a townhouse, it's going from the backyard over the house to the tree in the front, but they got it done. I think it was about 5 years ago, I went over there with my master lock attached to the fishing line, and I threw it over the house. I think his wife thought I was going to break a window in the process, but we got the antenna up. So DC contesting is sort of odd, but nothing on Capitol Hill. And of course, my dream is about 8 evenly spaced wires from the top of the Washington Monument. All 540 feet in length, switchable in direction. I think that would work pretty well. Yes, sir. Who do I don't field day. It comes at a time when I'm either coaching baseball for my kids or just doing other stuff. And so oftentimes we're out of town because it's right before the July 4th. So I haven't done, quote unquote, done a field day in a while. We have in the DC area a number of groups that put together huge operations. I have to say, ham radio for me is like a seasonal thing. It's almost like about October the 15th, I start thinking about it, and then when it gets cold, I'm on the radio on CW through the winter time, and then about the time that March rolls around, then I get into something else. So field day, we did a bunch at college, but I really haven't done many since then. Yes, exactly. Yes, sir. Oh, dozens and dozens. I don't know how many. I know I bought a 222, one of those crazy 222 Chinese FM radios last year, and I couldn't believe I must have hit about 25 of them. I was really surprised. There's a lot of, there's a lot of 2 meters. There's a lot of 440. There's a lot of even 1296 repeaters up in our area as well. Yeah. 0. I don't know where I got it. My dad couldn't be anyone he would never have done anything like that. My mother certainly wasn't interested. Nobody in my family. I just got interested in radio. And, I guess it flowed into being in news and being on the radio. But no, I had no real Elmer. Nobody told me about ham radio. I simply stumbled onto those SSB signals while DXing and wondered what they were all about. I could hear them on my shortwave radio. So I'm one of those people that came into the hobby without having somebody down the street who had an antenna up, and I went to ask him what it was all about. Yes, sir.
You delivered the Detroit Free Press?
Yes, sir.
Where did you deliver it?
Just outside in Grosse Pointe Park. How about you? You from up there? Yeah, okay, yeah, my dad was born in Royal Oak in Berkeley and grew up there. So he delivered papers, and so like a good kid, I delivered papers too, yeah.
I delivered the Free Press myself, but it was quite a few years before.
Well, it was one of the great sort of starting points in my life. I was glad I did. It got me into paying attention to the news and then figuring out what to do. And like I said, bought that Sony ICF 5900W that still sits up in my shack now, yes. I have a Kenwood TS2000. I mainly, I have antennas up right now. I put a 160 and an 80 meter antenna up just a few weeks ago. I took my antennas down during the summer for some stuff. I fool around on everything, 2, 6, 432, and have a 1296 antenna as well, but I don't have anything mounted up right now. We moved a couple of years ago, and I have just simply not gotten some antennas chimney strapped. But there's no big tower in my future. There never will be a tower in my future, but I have wire, and I have played around a lot in recent years with phasing antennas, 160 meter inverted Ls, or trying different lengths. Like on 80 meters, if you ever try a 210-foot wire fed from the ground, that works very well. 105-foot wire on 40 meters, you can get some different things like that. So I've done a lot with phasing verticals, and let me tell you, it's sort of hard to wrap your head around with the different lengths of coax and everything like that, but once you realize it, you can have two antennas. Well, it's the basics behind a four-square, if you're familiar with that. You can have two antennas about 66 feet apart, and you can figure different ways to send that signal, either crossways or end fire off the end. And so I've done a lot of work with that, given that I have a small suburban backyard, and been fairly successful with it, or at least I think I have been. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with Braxton, Michigan?
I am not, no. Sorry about that. All right, yes.
What was your degree in?
My degree was actually in broadcasting from the University of Florida. Yeah, so I actually followed up and got into radio immediately after college and kept with it. It's been, as I say, I've been riding a wave with WSB and with Cox since I got the job. There was a woman who had the job in 1988, and she told the bureau chief that she wanted to do TV, and the bureau chief said, "You're not going to," and so she quit. And there were about 8 of us who were freelancing on Capitol Hill at the time, and we all applied for the job, and I just happened to get it. So if not for that one little left turn in life, I'm not sure I probably would have gone to work on Capitol Hill like my parents. That would not have been as much fun as what I've been able to do over the last 25 years. My first political convention I ever covered was here in Atlanta, the Democratic Convention in 1988. Even though I think HamJam, they used an old thing. I think I've covered 13, it's either 13 or 15 national political conventions now. And it never ends. It's lots of fun. It's lots of work. But tune in during the week, Monday through Friday, and you can hear the latest from the trail. It's an awful lot of fun. Unfortunately, I really have to go because I have to run to the airport immediately and catch a plane down to Jacksonville, where I'll be doing an event tonight with Neil Bortz and Herman Cain. And so I was thankful I was able to squeeze this in. Last night, I got some phone calls from the bosses who wanted me to come home immediately to do stuff on the terror attacks yesterday, and I said, we're going to sacrifice 2 different station events. Do we have to do that? And so they nicely let me stay, and I'm really happy to see such a great turnout today and to meet so many of you. And as I always say, see you on the radio. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie Dupree. Thank you for spending the time with us here at HamJam, and this is to commemorate your visit to us, and I hope you remember it. We'll remember you for a long time. I didn't get to ask my question about what was your best blooper on the air.
We were talking about, I said black erected officials instead of black elected officials. It's one of those difficult moments in life. But it wasn't as bad as my co-anchor who didn't want to pronounce certain names in Africa, so she would pause, and then I would say the name, and then she would continue with the story.
That is rich. That is really good. Thank you so much, and I will be listening.